not walk across that stage. You won't slide across that stage. Motherfucker can't pull you across that motherfucking stage. Kanye, that little kid singing about the shit. No, the joke's on you. You throw your hands in the air and wave goodbye to everybody as you get the off this campus. What the you gonna do now?
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In our last video, we saw the arguments made by Charles Lawrence, who wants to ban hate speech well beyond what the Chaplinsky fighting words doctrine would allow. As we saw in RAV versus St. Paul and in Doe versus Michigan, courts have employed that fighting words doctrine to strike down hate speech codes if and when they might touch speech that should be a part of the free marketplace of ideas. In some sense, Lawrence also endorses the marketplace of ideas. He's clear that he wants a campus speech code that's careful to protect classroom speech so that people can speak about and debate all ideas. But he's skeptical of that marketplace concept when it's applied too broadly. Lawrence says that the so-called marketplace of ideas has in fact failed us when it comes to issues of racial equality. He says this: "The American marketplace of ideas was founded with the idea of racial inferiority of non-whites as one of its chief commodities, and ever since the market opened, racism has remained its most active item in trade." What racist speech does is denigrate African Americans, he says. How can a sufficient marketplace operate when the effect of some speakers is to say, oh, don't listen to them, don't take their interests seriously, they're just blanks? When the racist speech dismisses the concerns and the interests of some people, how can a marketplace really work? So he thinks that white believers in First Amendment absolutism barely see the harm that's done by racist speech. They're solicitous, they are concerned about the liberties of bigots, but they barely notice that the victims of hate speech suffer a loss in liberty as well. Racist speech itself has caused them to dismiss the concerns of blacks and not to see those concerns. So he raises this accusation on page 477. "Those who raise their voices in protest against public sanctions of racist speech have not organized private protests against the voices of racism. It has been people of color, women and gays who have held vigils at offending fraternity houses, staged candlelight marches, counter-demonstrations, and distributed flyers calling upon their classmates and colleagues to express outrage at pervasive racism, sexism, and homophobia in their midst, and to show solidarity with its victims. Traditional civil libertarians have been conspicuous largely in their absence from the group expressions of condemnation." But this is where Nadine Strossen says, wait, hold on a second there. She says that civil libertarians like herself, those in the ACLU, are committed just as much to the eradication of racial discrimination as they are to the promotion of free speech for all. But because civil libertarians have learned that free speech is an indispensable instrument for the promotion of other rights and freedoms, including racial equality, we fear that the movement to regulate campus expression will undermine equality as well as free speech. Combating racial discrimination and protecting free speech should be viewed as mutually reinforcing rather than antagonistic goals. Strossen acknowledges Lawrence's point that free speech as an ideology can be used as a cover by racial bigots, but she says it can also and especially be used and has been used by crusaders for social justice. So she asks you to think about the civil rights movement there. And it's not just that she thinks that practically the goal of ending racial discrimination will be better served by allowing unfettered expression. She also endorses, ideologically, the million libertarian theory of the Constitution that says that the very purpose of the First Amendment is to foster that marketplace of ideas, regardless of the ideas that may be expressed. And while she opposes racist, harassing, discriminatory conduct, she holds this to be separate from speech. At the very least, you can draw some relatively distinct line between speech and action in this instance. So let me tell you about 3 arguments that Strossen uses to counter the arguments for the type of expansive speech code that Lawrence approves of. First, Strossen says that speech, to be regulable, must create a direct face-to-face harm. It must, in a sense, trap its victim. Here she's using the concept of the captive audience that's been used in some court cases. You'll remember that Lawrence had wanted a speech code for Stanford that went way beyond punishing speech that was stated face-to-face. One of the incidents that actually gave rise to the Stanford speech code in question was the posting by a white student of a picture of Beethoven made to look black on the dorm room door of an African-American student. So Strossen says that if Lawrence wants a speech code that would ban that type of speech, it'd be overbroad. Not only is that speech not said directly to the face of the insulted student, but that student could escape the speech if they wanted to. The African-American student, she says, is not a captive audience forced to listen to something injurious. They're more like someone taking a stroll through Washington Square Park who hears something offensive that they don't wish to hear, but they could avoid hearing that speaker just by changing the direction of their walk, walking through another park, not listening. Second argument that Strossen makes. She wants to protect speech unless it essentially gives rise to violent or unlawful conduct. So she uses something essentially like Mill's harm principle here. You'll recall that Lawrence had said that racist speech is 100% speech and 100% action, but Strossen doesn't buy that. For her, discrimination against minorities is something that the government can take an interest in. It is something that the government can punish in the interest of equality. It is unlawful conduct, that discrimination, but it has to be a discriminatory act which is tied quite closely to the denial of equality. Equal opportunity of job advancement in the workplace, we might think, or equal opportunity to learn in school. She says that for harassment to be banned, it has to interfere with a student's education in a more tangible, specific manner than simply creating an environment in which the victim feels that they cannot speak or feels that they have a second-class status in the eyes of others, as Lawrence seemed to suggest. And then the third, and maybe the most important of Strossen's arguments, is this. She's worried about the application of Lawrence's argument because even if he is correct about the injury that words can cause, not just direct harm, but harms to democratic equality, Lawrence's preferred type of speech code is to her viewpoint discrimination. You'll remember this issue came up in RAV in Doe. She says this, viewpoint-based discrimination constitutes the most egregious form of censorship and almost always violates the First Amendment. This is a constitutional defect of the rule advocated by Professor Lawrence. He endorsed a version of the Stanford regulation that expressly would have excluded speech directed at dominant majority groups. So, because Lawrence's preferred code, although not the Stanford code as written, is only meant to protect minorities, African Americans in particular, from hateful speech, then it is, in Strossen's mind, choosing one viewpoint, albeit the racist viewpoint, to condemn. But that's precisely the point of Lawrence's argument. Let's say a speech code specifically banned the N-word from a campus when used as an insult to someone's face. The code would be banning that word because, Lawrence says, it carries along with it a long-standing viewpoint, which is precisely the viewpoint that makes it harmful. The viewpoint of African Americans as of lower civil status than whites. And it's because that word has been connected to those institutions of racism, Jim Crow and etc., that the second-class civil status that it conveys is still a pervasive reality in our society, even though those specific institutions might have faded. That is, the racial discrimination persists because the viewpoint attached to it persists. And in Lawrence's mind, one step to ensuring the guarantees of the 14th Amendment is to keep people from using that viewpoint in precisely those situations that perpetuate racial discrimination. So we saw this paradox in American Booksellers versus Hudnut, and then in RAV as well. Viewpoint discrimination is agreed to be against the principles of free speech, but can't the government ban precisely those viewpoints that harm the equal rights of others? We can talk about empirical questions like whether pornographic or racist speech really does the harm that McKinnon and Lawrence attribute to it, but there's a more fundamental question at the base of all of this. It's a more fundamental question that can only be solved with philosophical arguments. Does the principle of free speech really require unfettered expression in the marketplace of ideas? Or is it meant to allow us to discuss specifically political and social ideas such that we could in fact ban some worthless speech if, by so doing, we invite more people to enter into the political dialogue, more people to enter into political and social discussions on a basis of democratic equality? That's the question and the conversation that I want to have with you when we meet together in class. So I look forward to talking with you about it. I'll see you then.